Well, welcome to the next episode of what I hope are going to be many of Philly Trial Lawyer Stories. And this is going to be a continuation of where I left off with my client, Frank Sheeran, who later became the Irishman for the movie who Robert De Niro played. My name is Glenn Zeitz, 2 N's, not one. I don't want to be cheated. I've been a trial lawyer for over 50 years. This podcast is about my cases and stories of my clients, like Frank Sheeran, the Irishman who Robert De Niro played in the movie, Vera Koking, who was an elderly widow on Social Security in Atlantic City, where I sued the Trump Organization and Trump in 2 different cases, and other clients who I found in my life to be fascinating and interesting people. On May 31st of 83, I appeared in court with the judge who we tried the case with. And this was the purpose of resentencing, because as I mentioned, we had got the mail fraud convictions thrown out. So it meant that the RICO case, the RICO charge was still intact, but that the predicate offenses for the actual racketeering charge itself were labor law violations, like the free use of a car. And there was something else, I think, involving another car that he got. So the judge, I got to be honest, it really pissed me off. After all the work that we did, he gave him the exact same sentence that he gave him originally. So that meant what he had done one thing that was very helpful. He gave Frank bail pending his appeal. So while we were appealing from the date of his conviction, he was out. He was able to be with his family and have his freedom. But this meant for the first time in Frank's life, he would have to go to jail. So on June 3rd, which is pretty quick, according to my chronology here, he self-surrendered. And that's a privilege that they grant to an inmate or person who's been convicted and they feel is not a threat to the community and is not a flight risk. And if you get that, it helps you with your parole board later when they see that. Because what happens is this. In every federal case, what they do is they prepare a pre-sentence investigation. They get into your background. They get into your prior record. And they come up with a score, with regard to you. So the bottom line was that if we could argue that Frank met all the criteria and he turned out to be a model prisoner, he would only have to do 1/3 of his sentence. Now, I'm not trying to minimize 6 years, but when you hear 18 and you read in the book 18 did not have to mean 18. It could easily have meant, if everything worked out, 6, and he then would have been eligible for parole. And I had an understanding with Frank at the time because I told him, I said, I'll handle your parole hearing. I'll be up there or wherever you are, wherever you end up in terms of where you have to do your time. I said, I'll be there for you. So that was our understanding. So what happened then is Frank was now in jail for the first time, and he began a letter writing campaign. And he wrote a lot of letters. And then later, at some point, he learned how to type, or he knew how to type, and he got really good at typing. So I would get typewritten letters. He would send out typewritten letters to a lot of people. And I kept these letters. And I didn't have the heart to throw them out. So I'm going to read some of them because they really are meaningful to me, because it shows the relationship that I had with Frank, which wasn't just lawyer and client. We were friends too. And I mentioned before, we were drinking buddies from day one when he first hired me. So here's the first letter that I found after he's in jail. At the top, it has some letters. D-O-T And then above it, it says, do you know what the letters mean? And I found out afterwards when we had a chance to talk that because he's writing from prison, he was concerned about the people in the prison, the guards or whatever you want. They prefer to be called, not guards, but the people who were in there and, who he has to answer to, I guess, for one of a better way to put it. Here's what it turns out that they meant later. It means don't open the fucking letter. DOTFL. So he put that on the letter, he had it on the envelopes. So basically, this was his way of letting them know they better not open anything that he sends to me. So I'm not going to read the whole letter, but he says here the following, because at the top he said, do you know what the letters mean? I didn't know them at the time, but I found out very shortly thereafter. He said, let's see what happens on the appeal you have in. He wanted me to talk about the fine because he also got a fine. And basically, he at that point, he was eligible for Social Security, I think. But the problem was that he lost his pension with the union because of the conviction. And then at the bottom, he says, give me your, and it looks like opinion, on the fine and the brief. And the way he signs off is, your drinking partner, Frank. Frank had a great sense of humor. When we would sit in restaurants, all the time, he had jokes he would tell. And he was, not only someone who could tell great jokes, but he was very interesting to be with. He was somebody who taught me, a young lawyer, life on the streets. And there's nothing better for a lawyer than to learn that and be able to understand that and what that's all about. So then I have another letter here, which I'm going to look at. And this letter is dated August 23, 1983, which is a letter that Frank, because he heard about the show 60 Minutes, and he wanted me to write to 60 Minutes. What Frank was trying to do, which ultimately, it turns out he was successful after a lot of effort and work and the book that came out. He was trying to figure out a way that he could safely monetize his story about the Hoffa case, but not put himself in a position where he was in legal jeopardy. And what I mean by that is the following. There's no statute of limitations on murder. So it means if he was going to get some kind of a book deal or any kind of a deal with anybody to try to monetize it and maybe help his family, which was fine by me, as long as he was careful, there was an opportunity he wanted to explore. And it was no secret. So anyway, I'm just not going to read the whole letter, but it was to 60 Minutes, attention to senior producer. And the letter confirms my telephone conversation with a representative of your program, during which we discussed the possibility of a segment of your show being devoted to my client, Francis Sheeran. Subsequent to the disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa, the government conducted an intensive investigation into the activities of Mr. Sheeran, including but not limited to his role as president of the Teamsters Union in Wilmington, Delaware. Literally millions of dollars are spent by the government both in surveillance of Mr. Sheeran and in 3 separate but related prosecutions on the federal and state levels. Some of the backdrop of the aforesaid investigation has been chronicled in the book known as The Teamsters by Stephen Brill and the Hoffa Wars. I want to mention one thing as an aside. The Hoffa Wars were written by a man named Dan Moldia. I know Dan. I've read his books. I've read every single book I could find on the Hoffa investigation, include the Hoffa Wars and Hoffa's Shadow and various other books that have been written. And as a book would come out, I'd read it to make sure there wasn't something new and different that I didn't know about. And that included the book that ultimately Frank wrote with Charlie Brandt, I Heard You Paint Houses. So anyway, I have a reference to Alan, which you should know about from the prior episodes. The main witness against Mr. Sheeran was and is a federally protected witness by the name of Charles Allen. Mr. Allen on various occasions provided the government with his version of the Hoffa disappearance, and he pled guilty to, among other things, a conspiracy with James Hoffa to kill Frank Fitzsimmons and others. During the course of my representation of Mr. Sheeran, he has vehemently denied the allegations of Mr. Allen. One of the things that Frank made clear to me, and in all the letters he wrote, and all the public statements that he made, and he wrote plenty of letters and typed out and sent letters to people like President Reagan and Senator Specter and Senator Thomas Eagleton, and I could go on and on. So here's what he put in, and a lot of it was he railed against the use of informants against people in cases. So the very last thing I put in was the following. As we discussed, Mr. Sheeran would like the opportunity to set the record straight in a form where he will be treated fairly and impartially. And then I sent a copy to Frank and a copy to the warden because, from our perspective, there's no reason to keep anything a secret about what was going on. And Frank was now in custody, and that's what we did. Now, the next one I have here is admittedly one of my favorites. He did the same thing again with the envelope, and he quizzed me. At the top, he says, can you, and it looks like the code or something, like, because some of his handwriting is kind of off the wall. Can you decode what is on the envelope? And it was the same thing, DOTFL. And he says, hi, Glenn, just a few lines to express myself. And then he says a number of things that were his personal feelings. And basically what it was about, without getting into each and every word, we were fighting on every level still to try to see if there's something we could do. There were appeals. Eventually we had filed a petition, which I mentioned, to the Supreme Court. We got nothing there. Then something called a 2255, 2241. These are all numbers for like habeas corpus and applications to correct or do something with a sentence. So we exhausted every avenue that we could find. And I had a really great young lawyer named Ray Cobb who did all the work on this. And I don't want to take credit for a lot of the work because he did it. And the understanding that I had with Frank's family and with Ray is I'd have a bill from Ray. Whatever I did was gratis. I didn't charge Frank for what I did. And then there were costs. So all I asked for was reimbursement for Ray and who I was paying, and then also the cost. But that was about it because I knew that Frank was in bad shape now financially. So here's what he writes on this page. I'm spending too much time in the law library. He says, maybe I can be your law clerk. And then he says, keep all the things I send you, which I've done. And he said, I would not be calling you if I did not think we were friends, not just the client. So keep working. And then he's got on the right, don't bill me for this. And then the next thing he has here cracks me up for the following reason. It says, Happy Yom Kippur or Patty Day. And then he has P.S. I hope you can just read this. Take your time, your friend, Frank. Now, the part about Happy Yom Kippur or Patty Day, I've got to mention this because I haven't mentioned this yet. I came from parents that were mixed in terms of their faith. And I had 4 grandparents. There was Ben and Lillian on the one side, who were my father's parents, and his name was Ed Zeitz. And then there was John and Mary, who were my grandparents on my mom's side. So I think you can figure out which side was the Christian side. You got John and Mary and Ben and Lillian. Now, my grandfather, John, he was a barber. And my grandmother, Mary, was a beautician who worked together. And they had a shop on Germantown Avenue in Philadelphia. And next door or two, a house or two down, was where my father was raised. And Ben, my grandfather, on that side, was an upholsterer. So basically, my family, including my parents, none of them went to college or law school. And they were all hardworking, good people in terms of a good work ethic. My mom was a stay-at-home mom. So when he wrote this, the reason why I laughed is there were some people in the mob who wanted to hire a Jewish lawyer. And Jay Cosman, who was Angelo Bruno's lawyer in Philadelphia, was obviously Jewish. And then he had also Sal Avina, who became a friend of mine, and Sal was his lawyer in Jersey. So when he put here Happy Yom Kippur or Patty Day, I think it's because when we would talk about stuff like this, I told him about my family. And basically what happened is my grandparents on both sides disowned their kids. So on the Jewish side, they said Shiva, like my dad was dead, and my mom's parents weren't much better. And when my grandfather, John, on the Christian side, found out that my dad and my mom were seeing each other, he offered to give him a free haircut. And my father told me the story that he was in the barber shop and my grandfather had a straight razor and there was a strap. And that my grandfather had the razor like up towards his face like this. And he was asking him in his own words, because he was from Romania, my grandma was from Hungary. He was asking him, are you like doing something, or however he said it, with Ketrin, which is the way he said Catherine. And my father was there with the razor, he's shaking his head, saying no. So that's why Frank wrote this, because when he would talk to me, I told him I didn't follow either religion. I didn't follow a religion. I was pretty much indifferent, and still am in many ways, to religion, because I just have certain feelings that about it. And eventually, the good part of the story is after my father went in the Air Force and he flew in the B-17 bombers, a number of missions in Germany, my mom was at home. And when he came back, they had me, and I was like what they called the baby boom babies. When all these men came back from World War II and they met their wives or girlfriends or whatever, there was a lot of babies. So it was kind of funny to me because Frank made a reference to both, and he didn't really care pretty much. We were just friends. So when he said that, Happy Yom Kippur or Patty Day, it reminded me, and does to this day, that when my grandparents were alive, we would go to one family for one holiday, then we would go to the other family for the other. So you could end up eating some food that I didn't really like some stuff. Like there was something called gefilte fish. I like the kugel part. And then we could go to the other side and we'd have like ham and macaroni and stuff, and it'd be Easter. So that's what he was referring to there. So here's the next thing that I have on my list of things that came up. And that was his parole hearing, which came up quite quickly. And that was on September 7th, 1983. And it was in, of all places, Sandstone, Minnesota. So I had to fly to Minnesota, and we had a parole hearing in Minnesota. So basically, what happened is I made the arguments for him to get the minimum parole that he could have to come out if he did his 6 years. And you don't know, they don't tell you at the hearing what their decision is. So I'll get to that shortly. But I did the best I could. Frank and I had prepared the whole thing, how we're going to present it, which we did. And then that was my one time in the great state of Minnesota. So then we waited, which is what you have to wait and do. And ultimately, the parole board voted, and they decided that his parole would be the 6 years. So that was significant because it meant that we knew we had a date that was the minimum date when Frank would be released from prison. But there still was the problem of the Delaware State case that was out there with Charlie Allen, John Tam, and the usual suspects. So what happened was, in terms of what went on, is he had a lawyer by the name of Tom Little. And the lawyer was a lawyer who represented Frank in the state case. And the state case involved basically a solicitation to commit crimes involving Charlie Allen. And it involved Allen doing certain acts of violence. And the allegation was that he was hired by Frank to do certain things and commit certain crimes. So Frank had gone to trial with Tom Little, and he had gotten convicted. And then what happened was, it appears from what my notes are here, that he was sentenced in January of 84 on the state court case that Tom Little had handled. And he got 14 years consecutive to the 18 that he got on my case. So that meant he had 6 that he had to serve. And because it was consecutive, he would have to serve whatever his sentence was in Delaware before he could get released. And that means the way it works is they put a detainer on you. And what a detainer is, it holds you when you otherwise would have been released from prison, and then they come and get you, and you're now transferred to another institution. So that meant that that's what his status was. He also had something that was designated for cases that involved the government's theory, mobsters. And it was something called CIM. It stood for Central Inmate Monitoring. It meant that anything that went on in Frank's case would be monitored in Washington, D.C. So if he tried to get a transfer to another institution, say closer to home, if he had a medical issue, whatever he had, he was in that category of special cases that have to go to Washington. So that meant that that pre-sentence report would follow him wherever he went. It meant that that monitoring would be done. And basically, it's like putting a spotlight on you when you're in prison. So anyway, the next thing that happens that I have here, I have another letter. And this is a letter that Frank wrote to me July 28th, 1984. And without getting into like each and everything that he said, here's what I think is like a relevant part. Because he always would express how he felt and how he felt about the government, what they did, Charlie Allen, rats, informers, people who get deals. He says, "You know me, Glenn. If you have something to say, say it, because they are not breaking my spirit." And then he put, "And I still can piss on his grave, and CA also, your friend Frank." And he was talking about, without me saying too much, CA was obviously Charlie Allen. And also, without mentioning the name, I got the feeling that it had to do with the honorable judge that gave him the same sentence again after we had reversed and got thrown out, all those other charges. All right, so what happens next that's relevant? Frank is dissatisfied with his lawyer, Tom Little, and he decides that he wants to fire him. And he obviously, I know that something's going to happen because he's going to tell me. So what he did was he hired a lawyer, and that lawyer happens to be Charlie Brandt, who wrote the book with Frank, I Heard You Paint Houses, about Jimmy Hoffa. And he sent a letter, certified mail, return receipt requested. And this letter was dated August the 12th, 1985. And he sent it to Tom Little. Now, I'm not going to read everything in the letter. It's a typewritten letter. You can see, typewritten. And as I found out, Tom became a pretty damn good typist. I should have taken him up on his offer to hire him. He would have been great in the office. And then here's what he said, basically. Now, he writes this letter from prison, from Sandstone, Minnesota, August 12th, 1985. Dear Tom, on a personal basis, I've always felt your friendship, and I hope you have felt mine. On a professional basis, you're well aware of the fact that I have not been satisfied with the results of your efforts, or frankly, your effort. And then he says, I'm angry, Tom. At age 64, I'm looking at the reality of beginning a 14-year sentence at age 68, 4 years from now. With this letter, I wish to advise you I have engaged Charles Brandt, Esquire, of Wilmington, Delaware, as replacement counsel in the above entitled criminal matter. And then he underlines, your services are no longer needed. I ask that you deliver all my files to Mr. Brandt so he can move forward now in my behalf. I ask that you offer Mr. Brandt any insights you may have in this matter. I am sorry that it has come to this, and he underlines, very sorry indeed. And then on page 2, he signs it, regretfully yours, Frank Sheeran, with a copy to Charles Brandt, PA, Post Office Box 85, Wilmington, Delaware, 19899, and a copy to Emmett Fitzpatrick. And if you remember, Emmett Fitzpatrick was the attorney that represented Frank in the racketeering case in Philadelphia, the same one that I represented Lou Batone in, and he sent a copy to him. Now, next thing that happens is he writes another letter, and he has on this letter his inmate number or registration number, Sandstone, and this is dated August 16th. And this is a letter to Charles Brandt, the Parkway Building, 11th and Benecroft Parkway, Post Office Box 85, Wilmington, Delaware, 19899. And then he says, Dear Charlie, at the outset, let me apologize for the typing paper. This is all that is available at this time. I want to address your letters of 8-9 and 8-5. I understand that my fee is buying items 1 and 2 in your 8-9 letter, but I am going forward along with the understanding that you intend to inject the following on a best effort basis. Now, I'm not going to read the following because these deal with legal issues and things that it could come in a category that they were going to deal with. So what he did was he hired Charlie back in August of 1985 to be his lawyer on the state court case where he had received 14 years. And he hired him to handle what turned out to be an appeal. So, and he also writes in there my fee. So, from the terms of this, he was going to pay some kind of a fee or have a fee paid for that basis. And then at the last page, he does the following. He says to Charlie, let's just be prepared to go all the way, as far as we must, because these years are too precious to lose. Sincerely, Frank Sheeran, and he sends a copy to Emmett. So in 1985, in August, and we're going to get to the book, and we're going to go over a lot of things in this book when I read it for the first time. And I'm going to go over certain areas of this book shortly, right here. You can see everything here, because when I read it, I wanted to see how much of it was true, how much of it was false, how much of it maybe was somewhere in between or a gray area or whatever, when I found out that there was a book later on that had come out. And we'll get to that. Now, the next letter I want to read is, in some ways, my favorite. I haven't even written a little note to myself. My favorite letter. This was at Christmas. And it was dated December the 17th, so it was 8 days before Christmas. And I celebrate Christmas. That's what I celebrated in my home with my mom and dad. So it's December 17th, 1985. He says, how's the family? I suppose your sons are big men. Put them in the Teamsters. But one thing, do not let them become FBI agents. Now, at this time, I had two boys, Chris and Jordan. I think I mentioned him before. If I didn't, I'm going to mention it again. He had bought my kids when they were really little, or somehow got 2 3-piece suits for each of them, which was really memorable. So then he said the following. I'm sure you will teach them or bring them up not to be informers. Then he has passed, and this meant past this, but he has passed this on to your sons for the future from me, my friend. If they compare themselves with others, they may become vain and bitter. For always there will be greater and lesser persons than themselves. But remember to tell them everybody just puts their pants on the same way, Glenn. I bet you never thought Frank Sheeran would get, and then he tried to spell this, but it looks like philosophically or philosophical. That's what he meant, I can tell. I think that is spelled right. Well, my friend, take care. Your friend Frank, first drink at the rickshaw is on you. So Frank, through it all, everything he went through was not only courageous in the way in which he handled himself going to jail, but he kept his sense of humor. And the part about don't let your kids become FBI agents, that didn't happen. One, Jordan, my younger son, has been a lawyer for 20 years, and he does criminal work like me. The other one, Chris, is a realtor and a surfer. And they're both good kids. Next thing I want to go to is the following. And this is in my website as the case that we put in, because this is the case and the decision that Frank got when Charlie Brandt was representing him. And I'm going to read from some of the portions. The case is Sheeran versus State. And there's a citation. All cases have citations. It's 526 Atlantic 2nd, 886, 1987. Supreme Court of Delaware. Submitted February 24, 1987. Decided May 27, 1987. Charles Brandt, Wilmington, for appellant. That was Frank. And then underneath it has Richard E. Fairbanks Jr. argued, Chief of Appeals Division, and Lawrence C. Myers, Deputy Attorney General, Wilmington, for appellee. And the decision that was rendered was by a Justice Holland. And once again, I said to you before, I couldn't represent Frank. I wasn't licensed in Delaware. I've never been licensed in the state of Delaware. We were able to get in those days, as I mentioned before, what's called pro hoc vici. They allowed you in federal court, if you had someone who would stand up for you, who was licensed in Delaware, to sign the appropriate papers. And I mentioned before how the judge allowed us all in because we all were Philly lawyers who were representing these people. There's a few parts in the opinion, but I'll get to the bottom line fast. His appeal was denied, and he was left with the 14 years. So here are some of the, just briefly, I'll go over some of the words that were in the opinion and what it referenced. It talked about facts first. From October 1978 to February 1979, Charles Allen worked for the defendant Sheeran. Sheeran was the union president at Teamsters Local 326 in Wilmington, Delaware, and hired Allen ostensibly as a union organizer. In reality, both men understood that Allen was being hired by Sheeran to do anything that Frank Sheeran would ask me to do, such as burning down buildings, beating up people, anything he would ask. Unknown to Sheeran, Allen was an FBI informant and was wired with a body recorder. Transcriptions of secret recorded conversations between Sheeran and Allen formed the basis of the charges against Sheeran, which resulted in the convictions, 1982 convictions. Count 1 dealt with blowing up a building. Count 2 dealt with an assault. Donald Emmenheiser at his home in Maryland, and there were tapes on both. And then, at the conclusion, as we conclude, there is no basis in the record for reversing either of Sheeran's convictions. So that meant Frank had a 14-year sentence in Delaware that he had to do. It also meant that he had a lawyer in Delaware at that time, Charlie Brandt. Then they also had argued in some fashion that he had challenged the convictions on the basis of double jeopardy. That's where they can't prosecute you again for the same offense. And that the RICO acquittal would bar the prosecution. So I want to just make a reference or two in here because there's things about this that make it clear as a result of handling the Delaware state case that Charlie Brandt was well aware of the activity of the facts in the state case, because part of what they were arguing is because of the acquittal in that case, he should have been prosecuted in certain offenses. So here's what it says. We now turn to Sheeran's final challenge to his convictions. In 1979, a federal grand jury in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania charged Sheeran and Louis J. Battone. As you recall, that was my client, and Emma Fitzpatrick represented Frank, with violating the Racketeer Influence and Corrupt Organization Act. They called it RICO, but that's the legal title. Then they had a citation of what it was. It says, Sheeran and Battone participated in an enterprise affecting interstate commerce through a pattern of racketeering. Then it goes on, and they talk about hiring Allen to do the work. And that Sheeran was alleged to have instructed Allen to cause an explosion at Hiab of Newark, Delaware, and to assault an official. And they mention the acquittals. And then they go on and they make a final decision. And they say that Sheeran's prosecution in Delaware was not barred by these acquittals. They also talked about, because I mentioned I had previously talked about words like candy in Frank's case, meaning dynamite, that I had in the federal court. And they mentioned at the very end that they often conversed in code, half-finished sentences, seemingly innocent references, innocuous acts, and the acts recordings were replayed for the jury. And Allen explained what this language meant. So that means that Frank, at that point, at least in terms of his procedural rights, had this conviction and had 14 years. So then I have a memo here, which is important because according to my timeline, and I mentioned the decision of the court denying his appeal, but eventually Frank got out, and it was sometime from what I recall in 1993. And Brandt, when we get to the book, mentions in the beginning of the book, he says, I heard you paint houses as a whodunit, but it's not a novel. It's a history based on one-on-one interviews of Frank Sheeran, most of which were tape recorded. I conducted the first interview in 1991 at Sheeran's apartment, shortly after my partner and I were able to secure Sheeran's premature release from jail on medical grounds. Immediately after that 91 session, Sheeran had second thoughts about the interrogative nature of the interview process and terminated it. He had admitted far more than he was happy with. I told him to get back in touch with me if he changed his mind and was willing to submit to my questioning. Well, I'm not saying an interview didn't occur in 91, but certainly in order to represent him on the Delaware state court case and be his lawyer up to and including the appeal, and then after assist him in getting out on parole because he had to be paroled from Delaware. There had to be some form of things that happened before 91 that they talked about, I would think. But that's what's in the book. So the book itself, I have a note here. When I read it, and there's a date here of March 4th, 2017. And what I got was the paperback version. There was a hard copy version that came out earlier, but the one that I got had something in addition, which I'll get to, which was an additional portion to the book that was added later on. So I got what I believe to be and know to be the full book. So anyway, I want to go over that, and I want to talk about the book. I want to talk about areas in the book. The book, in the best way I can characterize it, consists to a large extent of Frank, where there's quotations telling Charlie Brandt certain things that happened. And the best way I can describe it in general terms is I call it faction. And what I mean by that is when you read the book, there are certainly things in this book that definitely happened. And I know that for a fact because I was involved in this as Frank's lawyer. So I knew certain things that happened. And then after he got out, we continued our relationship because here it is. And I have down here, Frank, I'll see you next week for some Crown Royals. And that was August the 18th of 93. So I couldn't very well have been drinking Crown Royals or drinks with Frank if he was in prison. We had to be at a bar together. And that went on, and it continued on. And I knew from day one that Frank wanted to figure out a way to monetize his story and be able to leave a legacy to his kids. And I want to say clearly and categorically, that's always been fine with me. And it was one of the reasons why I sat back on the sidelines and let everything unfold so that at the point in time when I would talk about anything that would involve this, whatever happened that could help his family or help him in some way after his death would take place. So what happened was this. I started reading the book and I had decided to do the following. And I'm going to get to specific portions in a minute, but I want to get to how I approached this whole thing. When I realized that there were things in this book that were incorrect, I had to get every single piece of paper I could, because what had happened was, other than a core file of some things, some transcripts, the letters, various other things, I had destroyed a lot of what I had. So I had to get all that back some way. So what I did was I embarked on this effort to contact the federal archives that would have archives about all the cases, the 2 federal cases in Delaware, the one case with Eugene Boffa and his co-defendants, Frank's case, the federal cases that we had in Philadelphia, which I went through this effort. And I was successful, but it took a lot of time. I want to read a letter I got. I had, as I mentioned, I had contacted archives. It was a federal bureaucracy like you can't imagine. It took me weeks to go through the bureaucracy and get the right people. And then finally, when I did that, and they give you what's called an ascension number and all this other stuff, I got a letter together with 5 banker's boxes. A banker's box is one of these. And there were 5 of them. And they were waiting on the front of my property, filled with paper. And I got a letter from Kimberly Wilkinson with an invoice, which I had to prepay. And they gave me a break. It says invoice for copying records of USA versus Boffa and Sheeran in the amount of $3,258. April 27, 2017, 2:22:26 p.m. Hi, Glenn. Your receipt is with your UPS packages. The tracking number is the following. Thank you, Kimberly Wilkinson. And then it shows 5 boxes. And what she said to me, it was one of, if not the largest copying bill they got with regard to something like this. And then they gave me a break. She said, we didn't charge it for the freight. So I didn't get charged for freight, but I had to give a credit card to them before they would ship everything. And then I got everything. I got 5 boxes of documents. And what I did then is I took a look at everything that was in these boxes, and laboriously and slowly, I had to reread and read everything that was in there. I had to write everything that I had, create new files, read all the transcripts, and take these yellow stickers that you see that I used on the book. And I had yellow stickers on all the documents, red stuff that I thought was important and relevant, and that would be relevant to the Hoff investigation, which I knew about, and also the book and the contents of the book. So I'd be in a position to say what I felt I had to say about it, but only after I had the material that I felt I needed to review and be in a position to do this. Additionally, I decided to do the following because of what was written in the book. I hired, and I mentioned his name before, an investigator, not Russ Collins, investigator Richard Mackow, M-A-C-K-O. And Richard was in the FBI for many years. He was shot. So Richard, whose resume is extremely impressive, interviewed people that are mentioned in the book, many of whom I couldn't interview myself. And then I paid Richard for his time, for the interviews that he took of many of the people who are referenced in this book, I Heard You Paint Houses. Thank you for listening to Philly Trial Lawyer Stories. If you want to learn more about me or my cases, go to glennzeitz.com, GLENNZEITZ.com. If you want to support Philly Trial Lawyer Stories, please leave a review wherever you get your podcast. And make sure you tell your friends and family too. Philly Trial Lawyer Stories is hosted by Glenn Zeitz and produced by Studio D Podcast Production.